Ready to learn how to make an anime style explosion effect? In this explosive sequel, we are going to cover the step-by-step process to build an explosion VFX. You can find a link to part 1 covering the beam effect in the description if you missed it. But no worries, these tutorials are self-sufficient, so feel free to jump right in and pick your favorite bits for your own creative explosions. We're going to work on different objects needed for the impact frames. This step is very subjective with no right way to do it. Almost like contemporary art, but I will describe my steps anyway. Start with a cylinder and add additional loop cuts. Edit the shape of the object to your liking. I'm going for this conic shape. We will then go with a classic emission shader. For that, add a transparent BSDF, emission and mix shader nodes. Create two new shape keys, which we will use to deform the object over a few frames. Set that new shape key value to 1 and edit the shape of your object to make it larger. Add a displace modifier and use a noise texture. Create a vertex group and assign the bottom vertices. If you do not have enough like me, just add more loop cuts. Then select that vertex group in your displace modifier. This is to give it an electric effect. For the animation, start by making the shape very thin on frame 31st and add a keyframe at frame 35 to its original size. You can then keyframe the shape keys over these 4 frames. After that, go to the Object Property tab and in the Visibility section, add keyframes for the viewports and renders so the object is visible starting frame 31st and not visible before that. Moving on to the second object. Add a cylinder and change its shape to make it thinner like a coin. Then add 2 simple deform modifiers. Set the first one to stretch and the second one to twist with an angle of 360 degrees. Add a displace modifier. Create a new material with a transparent BSDF, an emission and mix shader. Change the color of your emission to green and increase the strength. Continue with a noise texture and a color ramp and input it in the factor of the mix shader. Add a math node after the color ramp and set it to multiply. This will make it easier to animate this shape. Keyframe its scale over 5 frames and disable this object before and after these 5 frames in the object property. Keyframe the multiply value over the 5 frames to make the effect sort of dissipate. The next object is simple. Add a circle and in the edit mode, press A. Select everything and F to fill the face. Apply the same emission material as you used before and animate its scale over 2 frames, starting with the last frame of the previous green object. Okay, we are now done with the impact frames. Let's get into the meaty bits and we'll start with the red sphere of the explosion. Add a sphere, scale it to the right size and let's work on its shader. Go with the usual emission, transparent, color ramp and mix shader nodes. After the emission, add another color ramp and a layer weight. Then connect the facing input into the color ramp. You will see the left color being at the center of your sphere. Right click on the object and select Shade Smooth. Play with the color ramp, layer weights and emission values until you're happy with it. I went with a sort of black hole at the center of my sphere type of effect. For the animation, keyframe from frame 42 to frame 71 to keep the same scale. 20 frames later, rescale your sphere into a more linear shape. It will give it the effect that your sphere dissipates into a thin beam. The next object will be a sort of spherical electrical explosion, initiating the explosion. I took inspiration from Simon 3D electrical shader for this one. Start with the usual setup, then add a Voronoi texture and a color ramp, which you will plug into the factor. Make sure you have your blend mode set to alpha clip. Add a noise texture, Ctrl T to get your mapping node and set your texture coordinate to objects. Add a mix color node and set it to linear light. Plug your mapping node to the A input and the noise texture to the B input. Add a math node after the Voronoi and set it to subtract. Duplicate the Voronoi texture and plug it into the math node. Now add a value node and connect to the W of your 2 Voronoi textures. Play with the scale value of the mapping node as well as the color ramp to get a larger electrical effect. Add a pond frame to your value node so you get motion. Here's a quick view of the full node setup. You can now keyframe your object scale between frame 44 and 53 to make it expand. Remember to also keyframe the visibility in the Object Property tab, one keyframe before and after the animation, so it's not visible. We will add the burning dust effects, and this is pretty easy since we created that exact same object on a previous tutorial. So just duplicate this object and delete all animation data. Scale it up and keyframe from 46 to frame 59. Go to the shading tab and first create a new instance of the material by clicking on the number 2, so we don't mess with the previous objects. I forgot to do it on this step and had to go back to fix it. Change the blue color to something orange, red to give it a burning effect. For bonus style points, we want to give the effect that the dust is getting washed away by the wind. For that, add a color ramp and a noise texture. Play with the scale of the texture and set your blend mode to alpha clip. Also note, for such effect, I would generally tend to disable the shadow. Pound frame your X and Y mapping node to give motion to the noise texture. Also, if you remember, we had created an empty for the displace modifier. Find that empty and animate it towards the camera over roughly 50 frames. This will give the effect that the dust is getting pushed away from the explosion. Let's now tackle the fire tornado. Shift A, add a cylinder. In edit mode, remove the top and bottom faces and subdivide your mesh. Create a new vertex group and assign all your vertices to it. Now we are going to add a few modifiers to deform and twist that cylinder. Start by adding a vertex weight modifier. Choose the vertex group you previously created. In the fall-off, choose custom curve and tweak the curve as I'm doing. Under influence, create a new mask texture and make it a cloud texture. Next modifier is going to be a mask, and again select the vertex group you had created. If you play with the threshold, you should see your cylinder losing pieces of its mesh. We'll then add a smooth modifier to smooth things up and a simple deform modifier. Change the angle to 360. Let's add a subdivision modifier and moving to the top of the modifier list to make it even smoother. Now I want to add a displace modifier to break the perfect cylindric shape. Add or select the cloud texture. You can then play with the values until you're satisfied. Now I want to make the top of the cylinder wider. For that, go in edit mode. Select all the top vertices. Use X-ray mode to select the back vertices as well. Create a new vertex group and assign these vertices to this new group. Then add a new displace modifier, select the cloud texture and select that newly created vertex group. Again, play with the values until you're satisfied. Shading time. At this point, should I even say it? Transparent, emission and a mix shader. Add a color ramp after the emission and add a noise texture. A color ramp for the mix shader factor coupled with another noise texture. Add a little bit of detail and play with the color ramp until you get a similar result than me. As we've done previously, set your blend mode to alpha clip. Change the scale of your bottom noise texture and the colors of your color ramp to give it a fire look. And crank up the strength of that emission node. Next, we will want to animate the rotation of that shader. So in the mapping node of your top noise texture, add a driver to the X location. Make it a pound frame, then edit that driver, and in the expression, multiply your frame function by 4. Let's now animate this bad boy. Keyframe the current position on frame 45, then on frame 100, rotate it by 3600 degrees. This means the tornado will do 10 rotation in 45 frames, 1 rotation every 4.5 frames. Select the 2 frames, press T and set the interpolation to linear. Keyframe the visibility to start on frame 63. Add another scale keyframe on frame 77. What I want to do is to have the tornado gradually getting bigger from frame 63 and 77. For that, I need to change the origin points to the center of my bottom edge. Then I keyframe the scale on frame 63 to make the tornado smaller. Since I changed the origin, I need to duplicate some of the location frame to my keyframe on 77. Alright, that was a lot on that one. Catch your breath and play your animation a few times to make sure you have the timing right on everything. We are not too far from being done, so don't give up yet. Next, we want to do the wind that rotates. That one is simple. We are going to duplicate the fire tornado and just scale it up. We also want to make it less strong, so lower down the threshold of the mask modifier. In the shading tab, create a new instance of the material and change your color ramp to white and black values. Change your blend mode to alpha blend. This will give it a transparent effect. The next effect is going to be lightning. This one is the lazy but efficient methods. What I did is I went to production crates and looked for free electrical effects. Downloaded a couple, then imported it in Blender by doing Shift A, Image, and Image as Plane. In the Shading tab, I added an emission and transparent nodes which I plugged to a mix shader. I set the blend modes as alpha clip, repositioned the effect to hit it from the sky and duplicate it to make another one. The better way would be to add a variation and not the exact same one, but for the sake of the tutorial I just did it that way. I then created a new instance of the material and the texture and offset the animation by -4 frames. So the two lightning effects don't hit the tornado at the same time. Still with me? We're almost there. This will be the last object we create. We will do the rock particles that fly around. There are multiple methods to achieve this, but my way will be by using the cell fracture add-on. Just follow along and you will see. Create a cube, scale it up and subdivide it a few times. We'll give it a basic cell shader with a diffuse BSDF, shader to RGB and color ramp. Press F3 and search for cell fracture. If you don't find it, you may need to enable it in the add-on section of your preference. We will use the default settings and press OK. Change your pivot point to individual origins and scale everything down. Let's add all this to a new collection to not make a mess of it. Also at this point you can delete the other cube we had just created. Make sure you have all your objects selected and F3 randomize transform. Play with all the values to scatter your particles around. We want to remove some of these particles since we have too many. For that, disable everything else but the collection, F3 and select random and press X. Right click on the collection and click on instance to scene and disable the previous collection. This will create a new instance of the collection so we can animate everything at once. Animate it to your liking between frame 60 and 100. I'm going to give it a 3600 degrees rotation and set the interpolation to linear. I will also make these rocks smaller at the beginning of the animation so it looks like they get pushed away. Remember to also keyframe the visibility. We are done with all the objects. Now here is the final touch. We want to give the sphere a noise effect so it looks like the sphere is unstable. We had used that method in the previous tutorial. For that, go in the graph editor and on scale X and Y add a noise modifier. Click on restrict frame range and set it between frame 54 and frame 72. You can copy the modifier and paste it to the other axis. And we want to do something similar for the camera to give it a shaking effect. This is the last bit, I swear. Select your camera and in the graph editor, select your Y rotation and add a noise modifier. Lower the strength to 0.1 and restrict the frame from 54 to 100. Add another noise modifier and restrict the frame from 42 to 53. This is for the initial explosion, so we want the shake to be a little stronger. And duplicate that last one onto the X rotation. I believe it may duplicate the two noise modifiers, so delete the one that finishes on frame 100. Et voila, we are done. Thank you so much for watching this video all along and congrats to you for sticking to the end. Let me know in the comments what are your plans for this explosion effect. If you enjoyed, I appreciate any support by subscribing, hitting that like button and sharing this video. It really helps the channel. Once again, thank you for all your support and see you next time. Au revoir.